Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to get started at about 4 past the hour. So if you're on now, just hold tight and get yourself some water if you want, and then we will be getting started. Thanks to everyone who's hopping on. We're going to get started about 4 past the hour. So you're here. Feel free to go get a drink of water or something before we get started. Okay, cool. I think we'll get started. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for this training on power researching your landlord. My name is Molly Gott, and I'm a senior research analyst at twittlesis, the organization that is hosting this tonight. I'm joined by a couple of my colleagues. Lauren, you can wave. And Rob, you could wave, who are both senior research analysts at Little Sis, and do a lot of power research on the housing industry, the real estate industry, and powerful landlords. We're going to share with us this evening a bunch of tools and questions to ask ourselves as we are doing that. A couple of housekeeping things at the top. We don't have the chat open tonight because we're a bit of a big group, but we do have the Q&A open. So my other colleague, Allie, is helping us with tech, and she will also answer questions if you have them. Put them in the Q&A, and if there are ones that she can answer, she'll answer. And then some of our presenters can also answer questions. If you can kind of keep them to what is relevant to what we're talking about tonight and what we're training in, that would be great. But just know that we're not going to like stop for question and answers at any points. But so as questions are occurring, feel free to put them in there. Um, we'll go for about an hour and a half tonight. And I'm going to kick us off. So to start, some of you probably are familiar with Little Sis. Maybe some of you are less familiar. I wanted to share a little bit about who we are and what we are. So we are Little Sis. We are called Little Sis because we are the opposite of Big Brother. And we do several things. We are a watchdog research organization that specializes in power research and power mapping powerful people and organizations. So we do that research about a lot of people, corporations, elected officials, industries. We also train people in how to do that research, which tonight's training is part of. So we train activists and organizers, journalists, students, on the ins and outs of power research, as it relates to building movements and building campaigns. And then we also oversee some pieces of technology, one of which is our database, which is called littlesis.org. We sometimes call it the opposite, or sorry, a free, it's a free open source research platform that will help you make connections between powerful people, organizations, and corporations. And then there's also a mapping feature in the LittleSys database called Oligrapher, that helps you make really nice, kind of visually pleasing maps to show these kind of power networks that we're going to talk about this evening. So that's a little bit about us. Like I said, part of our work is training, and we have, like tonight's training, about once a month, trainings on different topics for the public. It's free, and you can sign up for them at littlesis.org/trainings. So tonight, as you hopefully know, we are doing Power Researching Your Landlord. Our next training in August will be Power Researching Elected Officials. And then in September, we will start our 4-part series called Research Tools for Organizers, which is really like a nuts and bolts 101, everything you need to know to become a skilled power researcher, in 4 sessions. So definitely think about joining us for that. And you can sign up for that again at littlesis.org/trainings. Couple other notes. So we're going to record this tonight and it will be shared. We'll share the slides and the recording. So as long as you registered for tonight's webinar, you will get those. So we don't have a chat open, but we did want to do a quick poll to give us a sense of who is on tonight, a little bit about who you are, where you are, and what kind of work you do. So I think my colleague Allie is going to launch that poll, and if you could answer these questions, it really helps us know who you guys are and kind of improve these trainings every time we do them. And we'll give you like 2 minutes to do that. Awesome. We'll give you like 30 more seconds. So if you're answering, finish up.
Got a lot of people new to Little Sis training, so welcome. And a lot of folks from the housing justice or tenant organizing world, which makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. So a little bit about how we're going to spend our time tonight. We're doing a welcoming right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about just kind of giving some kind of framing of why we at Little Sis focus on real estate industry, corporate power, kind of what that looks like and how it's organized in our current political moment. And then we're going to get into the meat of tonight's training, which is really kind of a in the weeds tools training that Lauren and Rob are going to lead. We're going to cover a few different topics. So first, we're going to talk about kind of untangling the LLC web around properties, which I'm sure is familiar to people if you've tried to do any real estate research where you live. We're going to talk about how to track donations from landlords and the landlord lobby to politicians. We're going to talk a little bit about identifying housing subsidies and then also talk about how to map out some of the board and personal relationships from landlords. And then we'll wrap up and share some more resources. So a couple of things we just wanted to say kind of as table setting tonight, which I'm sure many of you have encountered, are familiar with. But just to get us all on the same page is a little bit around why focus on landlords, why focus on the real estate industry in our current political moment. And I'm sure this will not be news to people, but we are living in a time of tremendous and concentrated power in the real estate industry, and in particularly the rise of ever bigger and wealthier corporate landlords that are controlling vast amounts of housing across the country. There's been a real acceleration in this since the 2008 financial recession, after which a lot of big Wall Street firms bought up houses that had been foreclosed and then turned them into rentals. In the multifamily housing arena, apartments, we've seen this kind of corporate, and it's intensifying and intensifying. And so we are all feeling that as tenants, and people who need housing in our day-to-day lives. And what that has meant is that these big corporate landlords class in the US has seized a lot of power and is trying to take more. We've been hearing a lot about tech billionaires, which are obviously an important piece of the puzzle. And there also are a ton of real estate billionaires. So there are 61 real estate billionaires in the United States right now. There's some examples on this slide and their net worth, some of the wealthiest men in the world. We've got Stephen Schwartzman from Blackstone, Donald Brunn from Irvine, and Bob Faith from Greystar, all massive, massive landlords that are both influential in terms of rents in this country and housing conditions, as well as the political context for housing. And there's been a lot of attention on these landlords, and there's kind of increasing consciousness around the role that they're playing in aggravating the housing crisis that we're all dealing with. So a couple of years ago, even the UN accused Blackstone, one of those big corporate landlords that's led by a billionaire, of using, quote, its significant resources and political leverage to undermine domestic policies that would in fact improve access to adequate housing consistent with international human rights law. And I think many of us, I'm sure on this call, are seeing how this works at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level in our cities and towns across all different kinds of housing, whether it's single family homes, whether it's mobile homes, whether it's apartments, that the real estate industry really has a stranglehold on housing policy in this country, although there's obviously many people fighting back and winning, which we'll also talk about. I think one of the things we wanted to share is this from Open Secrets that just tracks lobbying by industry over the last since 1998. And you can see real estate, the lobby spends a massive amount of money, over 152 million in 2024. And this really puts them right up there, neck and neck with other industries that we know spend a lot on lobbying and shape our politics in lots of ways, including the oil and gas industry here and the defense industry as well. So really, oil and gas, defense, real estate, and other Wall Street firms are among the top lobbies that are spending to influence policy in our country. Sometimes they're doing that as themselves, like Blackstone as Blackstone, or on your city level, maybe a powerful landlord in your city is lobbying around housing protections or rent control issues. But there's also lots of powerful lobbying groups that they do this through. And here's a slide that just has an example of some I'm sure people on this call have encountered. These are a bunch of national groups that represent corporate real estate power, but almost all of them have state affiliates and local affiliates. So again, oftentimes kind of our landlords in our cities and our towns have ties to a much broader power structure that's influencing housing policy kind of at every level. And we see that again and again, that in places where tenants are coming together and fighting for renter protections, their opposition is the real estate industry, is big landlords. And here's some examples from Philadelphia and New York where landlord lobbies mobilized to fight renter protections that eventually won. So people were able to come together and defeat these landlords for the day. But it's very clear that often, even when we're in campaigns where city council are the final decision makers around housing protections in their cities, or other kind of local governments who we're really up against and who's kind of shaping, who's kind of competing with us to shape the political conditions for housing in this country are these powerful real estate companies. And they know that and they say that and they say that it's integral to their ability to make money, to keep being able to evict people and to keep being able to raise the rent. So this is from Blackstone's annual report that they have to file with the SEC, to their investors, where they say just that. We may not be able to attract desirable tenants and may have difficulty evicting defaulting tenants. So we want to make it easier to evict people to make money. And then rent control and other changes in applicable laws could adversely affect our rental housing properties. So we also want to make sure that there's not regulations on rent prices. The more we can charge for rent, the more money we make. And that is our end goal. And so we're seeing this in all kinds of different ways, right? Where real estate companies both have a lot of influence over the political conditions, over policy that's being made, and then obviously also over the day-to-day lives of their tenants in terms of what their rents are, what the conditions in the apartments are. And as power gets more and more concentrated with these big corporate landlords, they also can become more and more sophisticated in the ways that they're able to rip people off, basically. So here's an example of that. A bunch of the biggest landlords in the country were sued because they were using an algorithm to basically create like a digital cartel by which they could all collude to raise rents. So the more and more kind of big, massive corporate landlords we have, the more and more sophisticated they get, but the more and more sophisticated we are also getting, which is the good news. Because I think that can all be a lot of overwhelming, but a little bit overwhelming, but we want to have kind of a clear-eyed understanding of what we are up against in fighting for fair and affordable housing in this country. And while they have a lot of power, the good news is that their power is not monolithic and it doesn't just come out from nowhere. They depend on a lot of relationships and resources in order to continue their day-to-day business of charging people rent, evicting people, and shaping political conditions for housing in this country. And that's really where power research comes in. And Lauren's going to give us a little bit of a definition on what we kind of define that to be at Little Sis in a second. But really, the heart of it is that if you have a landlord that you're trying to fight, no matter what the fight is, it is good to understand who that landlord is, how they operate, and what relationships and resources they need to operate. And there's a bunch of different categories that often come up when we're trying to map that out. One, of course, is properties. What do they own? If you know your landlord in your building or in a building that you're organizing, what are the other buildings that they own? What other kinds of real estate do they own? Do they just own residential real estate? Do they also own industrial real estate? Do they own commercial properties? You might want to know also what subsidies they've gotten for those properties. And what are their records at those properties? Have they been cited for code violations? Have they evicted people? You also might want to know a little bit about what is their relationship with nonprofit organizations and philanthropy. So, do these landlords sit on nonprofit boards? Do they give to any charities? And then, of course, you want to know a little bit about their business relationships. Who do they do business with? What bankers do they use? What attorneys do they use? What lobbyists do they use? For most of these real estate companies that we're talking about, there's the company, and then there's also the person and the people behind those companies. And so we might want to know, who are their friends and family? Are they part of any social clubs, any churches? And then last, what are the political networks that they're funding? What campaigns do they fund? Who are they lobbying? Who are their political allies? Who are they trying to influence? And when we do kind of a good amount of power research, there's lots of different ways that that can be applied in lots of different contexts. And I'm sure people on this call, as many people that are on this call, there's as many different ways that information can be used. At Little Sis, we really focus on how, in a campaign or movement building context, this kind of research can be used to shape strategy and tactics. So, some examples of how this kind of power research on landlords might be used is to pressure investors or business partners of a particular landlord, to expose wealth, just to expose like how much did your landlord make in their salary last year versus how much you're making and how much you're paying in rent. To do bird dogging actions to find out where is this landlord socialized, where might they be, where can we kind of get some face time with them. IDing public money that your landlord has received. It also might be helpful for collecting information for lawsuits, finding other tenants to connect with. We're going to talk a little bit about approaches for if one building that your landlord owns, how do I find the full list of buildings that they own? And then it can also be helpful for mapping political influence, like in some of those examples I was talking about in Philly and New York when you're fighting for legislation, but to map out in all the different ways that your opponents are trying to shape the terrain. And I'm going to hand it over to Lauren to talk a little bit more about what power research is.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Molly. Okay, so maybe maybe some folks on the call can kind of guess what is power research, but just to give a definition here, next slide, it is really research into powerful people and organizations. So those people and organizations that have disproportionate wealth and influence, and crucially, like what are the relationships between them? How do they make their money? How do they maintain their relationships? And so these are as Molly went through, these are the big questions that we can ask to really understand their power and how we can intervene to contest for that power. Slide. And so we kind of refer to, sorry, I'm gonna go back. This assemblage of people and organizations who hold disproportionate wealth as the power structure. So we're doing research into the power structure. Great. So let's get into really some research tools here. For folks on the call, you may have some experience with these different sources. We're going to talk about in depth a couple of them, but property databases at the city and county level are going to be extremely important, especially with some untangling of the LLCs that we're going to do. We're going to look through news articles, corporate websites. I know sometimes I've done like a right to know request. Rob is going to be talking about some campaign finance databases and how to look through subsidy records. And of course, there's our Little Sis database, which has a lot of great information. So always good to check there. All right. So these are a lot of online tools, but of course, there's tools that are not online. Just a reminder that some of the best information really comes from your own networks. Whether you're a tenant or organizing with fellow tenants, oftentimes the block captain will have great information about who are the developers moving into your block or your neighborhood, or even just, folks within your own sort of social circles. So definitely, if you get stuck online, or even if you don't get stuck, it's always a good idea to just talk in person with folks in your neighborhood, community members, faith-based leaders, etc. All right. Yes. And may we all feel this joy in person. Okay, so here we go. We're going to try to demo a couple tools together. We're going to do this by doing a little scavenger hunt. So imagine that you're a tenant or you're organizing with fellow tenants at 2953 Frankfurt Ave. This is affordable housing development here in Philly, where I'm based. We have this address, but maybe we're not too sure who the actual owner is. Maybe we pay rent to a property manager or a third-party service, or we're not really quite sure. So let's start with the address and see if we can figure out who's behind, so which LLC is connected to that which actual corporate landlord is behind that LLC, who's the executive or CEO, what's their business model, have they been involved in any violations or lawsuits, has this landlord donated to politicians, do they take advantage of federal housing subsidies, and then also who else is the CEO connected to. And all this information, being power research, is research that we could use in a campaign. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so one of the first things is that we're going to probably encounter an LLC. So before we even get to that, what is an LLC? It's a shell corporation, also known as a limited liability company. Landlords, developers will create LLCs to shield themselves and their larger corporations from financial liability. They're really easy to create. They have little regulation, so they're a very attractive way to do that. Oftentimes, landlords will create many LLCs. Sometimes I've even seen a landlord create an LLC per property. So that can make it really difficult to know not only who is your landlord, but generally if you're curious about who are the major evictors in your town or city, or which landlord has the most violations, who are the most negligent landlord. It's really hard to kind of piece that all together because they're hiding behind these separate LLCs. So let's go through a process to try to figure out that the ownership behind the LLC. And I'll say whenever you're kind of embarking on this journey to try to untangle LLCs, definitely take a piece of paper, start your notes, jot down any names and addresses that come up. And also, I wish us all to summon some fortitude in this process. Okay, so here's the step. Broadly speaking, we're going to do a couple steps here. We're going to take that address and search it through the local property record database and see what LLC name comes up. We're going to take that, and we'll go to each one of these sites. We're going to take that LLC and search it through the state level business entity database to then hopefully get the names of officers and additional addresses. And actually, Allie, do you mind sharing the links like when I go through each of them? We'll do them in sequence. Thanks. And then once we have the names of officers, we're going to take those and search them online and see if we can kind of trace them to a corporation, their corporate name, and then dig up more information through some of the websites and news articles. All right, so let's work through this example. We have 2953 Frankfurt. The first thing that we're going to do is try to find that in our local property records database. Since we're looking in Philly, Molly, do you mind stop sharing here? And then I'll walk us through it. Perfect. Okay. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is search for my city or town and then the phrase property record database. And so when you do this in your city or town, you'll put the name of your city, town, or county there, and then the phrase property record database. And usually that'll turn up where you can access this type of information. Each locality is going to look a little different. Sometimes they won't even have like a website, so you might have to go in person. But generally, most municipalities will have a place to do a property record search. So let's see what this looks like for Philly. Okay, great. Now let's search for this address, 2953 Frankfurt Ave. All right. And if you're following along, the website is property.phila.gov. The address is 2953 Frankfurt. And this is a hypothetical example, but this is actually an affordable housing development in Philly. And what we're seeing here with this property record search is that they list the owner as being this LLC, Kings Highway Apartments. All right, so I will note this down in my notes document. We got our first LLC name. Great. The other thing you usually want to note is this little piece right here, this mailing address. Let me zoom in a little bit. Mailing address. that is going to be where they receive their tax documents. Sometimes it can point you to their headquarters, but sometimes it can lead you down a wrong path and lead you to their accountant, or in this case, it's really just the address of the property, so it doesn't really add too much information. But take a note of this mailing address whenever you do your LLC searches. All right, so we have Kings Highway apartment. We're going to take that and open up a new tab, and we're going to do what's called a business entity search. So often, LLCs in certain states where they operate, they might have to disclose certain information. So what we're going to look for is our state, Pennsylvania. We're going to do business entity search. And usually where they have to disclose this information is with the Department of State, Secretary of State. So usually you'll get access to what's called a business entity search, where you can learn more about LLCs operating in a state. So let's go here. Let's go to the search. Again, in your state, this might look a little bit different. Usually you can find it by doing, like we said here, name of your state, business entity search. If you find a little search tool here, you're in the right place. And so let's enter in our LLC name, see what information comes up. A quick note is that in this case, we only get one result, which makes it easy. But sometimes you'll have an LLC that has a more generic name, which may have a lot of results that kind of look the same, maybe are spelled slightly differently. Try to make sure you're looking for a pretty exact match, so you're not inadvertently looking at an LLC that's not actually relevant to the one that you're trying to look for. So, okay, Kings Highway Apartments LLC. That matches, that's good. Let's click on it. And we see a couple pieces of information that we want to take note of. First one, officer. Okay, so this is the officer associated with the LLC, Philip Balderston. Right now, we don't really know who he is, but we're gonna write his name down. We'll look for him in a minute. And then we have this principal address of the LLC, 30 South 15th Street, Suite 301. Again, still not sure what that is, but we might need that later, so we're going to write that down. If you have, maybe you don't have in your state great access to this type of search, another place where you could look is Open Corporates. They're a pretty accessible site that has a lot of good information. They aggregate information about LLCs, so you could try searching there. But since we're able to use this, we can kind of just keep going. So let's search for Philip Balderston. All right, let's take his name. And really, I'm going to do just a simple web search, Philip Balderston. I'm going to say Philadelphia, so it doesn't give me too many results outside of that, especially if landlords or CEOs have more common names. You want to try to refine some of the search results. So let's do that. And already we have a couple interesting results here. We have this website here that looks to be a personal website of this person named Philip Balderston, who claims to be the founder and CEO of Odin Properties. Seems to be a real estate investment firm. Okay, so maybe that's the landlord. We have a LinkedIn page, also of Philip Balderston. We have a social media page, which we could look through a little bit more. And then we have here a document explaining how Philip Balderston of Odin has worked with Meridian Bank in some of his properties. So already we have a couple leads that could tell us a lot more about who this is. Let's just verify that this is the right person by grabbing that mailing address from that previous website, just to see, does that also link to Odin? And then we can be sure. Let's go back to our tab. Let's grab this address. and see, does that also link to Odin? I'm just going to search for it. All right, and already, okay, great. So this address seems to be kind of the address of Odin Properties, of their main office. We know that Philip Balderson is also the CEO of Odin, so we can feel relatively sure that that address that we initially looked for, that property in North Philly, is owned by Odin. Okay, so if we know that, can we find more information? And I'm going to go back to the slides real quick. All right, slideshow, here we go. Can everyone see those slides? Great. Okay, so from here, I think the next kind of natural step is to look at the corporate website of Odin Properties to learn a little bit more about them. We can look through their executive team page to see who else is kind of running the show. And especially if you're doing organizing, if you're organizing tenants, if you're organizing fellow tenants, maybe some of these names look familiar as people that you've had to deal with, but weren't quite sure where they were affiliated with. Maybe you know someone within your network who knows someone who works at Odin, and you have maybe an in there to understand more about their business operations. You can also look their corporate website about how they talk about themselves and really cut through some of their flowery language and really understand how are they operating their business. So we see here on their page, this is just a snippet from their about page, that they were founded in 2009. They purchased what they call challenging properties and overhaul them in neighborhoods that were underserved by other investors. So what can we kind of take from that? We can kind of take from that they, on the heels of the 2008 foreclosure crisis, they flipped homes and in primarily low-income or Black neighborhoods here in Philly. And these were neighborhoods that had been historically disinvested. And so flipped them into rental housing, extract rents. They say they manage approximately 10,000 apartments. So I'd say they're probably, especially in Philadelphia, maybe one of the mid-level landlords here in Philly. So we can turn to news outlets and some publicly published reports for additional information, both to confirm some of the research about ownership. So, just by searching for Kings Highway and Odin, it turned up this headline here on the top right about how Odin does actually own Kings Highway. But we can also turn to some of these sources to investigate some of our suspicions about about their business operations. So we see here some additional news articles about how tenants are rising up against Odin for poor living conditions and even launching a class action lawsuit against this landlord. Furthermore, we have some reports documenting Odin's nefarious business practices. So they have a long history of evicting tenants, nearly 1 in 4 units over the time sort of analyzed here. They have hundreds of open code violations in the time assessed. They were delinquent on their property taxes. During the pandemic, they were evicting tenants. Tenants were raising concerns about holes in the walls, flooded basements, mold. And despite all that, they received a PPP loan for a little over $1 million. So we can use all these different sources to get a clearer picture about who this landlord is, how they operate. You may get to this point and then ask the bigger question of, okay, so I know who the owner is for this property, but how do I know all the other properties they own? And this will be a not quite satisfying answer, but it can be very tough to try to piece together this full picture of all the properties because these landlords hide behind LLCs. But some places where you can look include the landlord's website. Sometimes they do list all the properties that they own, or at least like a big portion of them. So you can start documenting from there. Sometimes your municipality may have the ability to search property records by the name of the owner. So now that we know the name of the owner is Odin, if I lived in a city where you could do that, you could type in that name and search. Often LLCs will have the same mailing address. So you could try to search by that common mailing address and pull up all the records and all the different LLCs that are tied to that. You can also look at other, in addition to property records, you could also look at other sources. Court records, eviction filings will often list the owner of a property, their name or their LLC. So you'll get some sense of the properties that they own from that. Building code violations. Sometimes if you have access to that data, they will list the owner name or the LLC, so you can start piecing that together as well. You can always try some right to know requests. If you have access to a full list of properties in your town or county, and you're trying to look through a list of all LLCs to try to figure out which ones belong to a certain landlord, sometimes landlords will have almost silly formulaic naming conventions. So if I were a landlord, I've seen this where it's like their name and the number 1 and then the number 2. So it might be Lauren Parker 1 LLC, Lauren Parker 2 LLC. So sometimes that makes it a little easier. Sometimes they really latch onto a theme, whether it's Norse mythology or Lord of the Rings or something, they'll have like a theme with their LLCs. So that can be a clue in trying to piece this together. And then finally, there's a couple good examples of grassroots attempts to aggregate a lot of city data together to make searching for a landlord easier. So New York has a great example. They have a website called Who Owns What. Down there, you can see an example, but certainly other cities have tried to do this too. All right, so we were on a scavenger hunt. We still are. Let's review some of our findings. We started with an address and we found out that the LLC was Kings Highway Apartments LLC. Through doing a couple different searches, that led us to Odin Properties being the owner. We also found out that Philip Balderston is the CEO. We found out a little bit more about their business model, which is flipping homes to create substandard rental properties. We learned through looking at news articles that this landlord has been involved in hundreds of violations, even a lawsuit brought on by tenants over their living conditions and illegal rent collection. And so now we have a couple more questions that I'm going to pass to Rob to cover.
Great. Thanks, LP. Yeah, I'll ask you to run the slides for me for the next couple slides, and then I'll take over when I do the demo. Um, but yeah, so one thing we might be interested in again kind of building out this body of research on the web of influence of landlords is who are they donating to? Um, Now, this can be either, a sort of like a federal issue or a local one. It all kind of depends on like the context of your campaign, the sort of the size of your landlord. But today, I'm going to talk about. We can go to the next slide. Searching the Federal Election Commission database for information on who what politicians landlords donate to. The thing I'll say here is that where I'm going to do the FEC database just because that is sort of that's going to be relevant no matter what. Often as Molly kind of showed in the beginning, landlords in the real estate industry spend millions and millions of dollars on political influence that often shows up in favoring specific, presidential candidates. But again, in the local context, it's really important. And you will very frequently see these donations show up. In donations to members of Congress, specifically, but also, some political action committees as well. Um, but yeah, we can, once we have identified, who are some of the like actual people behind the corporations that own and control our homes, we can start investigating who they give to. And our two kind of big tools at the national level here are the FEC database and Open Secrets. I'm going to show the FEC database today in the interest of time, but Open Secrets can be really useful as well. Again, I think especially for your, really kind of big corporate landlords like Greystar and Blackstone, the folks that kind of Molly was talking about in the beginning of this training. We can go to the next slide here. So this is what, your landing page on the FEC website will look like. You can go to fec.gov to get there. And then we can go one more slide here, and this is oh, I must have removed that slide. So I'm gonna share my screen now, and I'm going to navigate over to the FEC database right here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click up on campaign finance data and look up contributions from specific individuals. And again, it sort of depends on, the context of your campaign, but often the first thing I will do here is just X out of these date filters at the top here, just so we can be sure that we are searching through, the entire body of records within this database. But you can search in here a few different ways. You can search just by a person's name. So I'll type in Philip Balderston, the CEO of Odin Properties or Odin Management. And we could see a couple of campaign donations, all, sort of both relatively recently here. One to a PAC called Malcolm PAC in Florida, and then, more recently to Sharif Street in Pennsylvania, where Odin is headquartered. Two sort of, large donations of $1,000. But, we might be interested in finding out more than just, who the CEO donates to. We might be, interested in looking up, who does anybody who works for this company give money to. In order to do that, I'll point out right here because this is a good example of it. In this employer field, you can see with one of these donations, Balderston has listed his employer as Odin Management, and another one he lists it as Odin Properties. And so we know those are both names that we're going to have to search when we're searching for employers in order to get the most complete set of information here. So I'm going to remove the search for Balderston here. I'm scrolling down, and on the left side, this is where all of our filters are. You see here we can search by specific zip codes, specific cities, specific occupations. I wouldn't recommend that just because there's so much variation in how people name their occupations. But the employer can be really useful. So here I'm going to put Odin Management, and I'm also going to add Odin Properties. And you can add up to 10 of these filters at a time. And so you can actually list a bunch of different corporations here. And what this does is this is kicking back all of the donations in reverse chronological order, from anybody who's listed their employer as Odin Management or Odin Properties. You can see here by the receipt date, it starts the most recent and goes down. But, it looks like a lot of these are fairly small donations. And so what we might want to do is sort this by the amount in order to determine, what are the really big donations. And here we can see that, Balderston kind of shows up among these top donations, but way more money is being given by somebody called Brett Torgan at Odin Properties. And if we click this little plus sign, we can see some more information about this donation, including, where the person lives, what their occupation is. So this is from the Chief Financial Officer of Odin Properties. And as we can see here, we have, a lot of donations to Democrats and Democratic PACs. And the last thing that we might do here is click this export button. And what that is going to do for us is that will package all of the search results here. If we scroll down, we can see we actually have 393 entries. So if I click export, this will bundle all 393 individual lines from these search results and put it into a spreadsheet file that we can then open in Excel or whatever spreadsheet software you like to use, and then you can start to manipulate it, and you can filter it, or you can make like a pivot table to determine how much this big donor, Brett Torgan, for example, has given altogether. If you're not familiar with some of those functions, I'm going to use this time to briefly plug another set of trainings that Lauren ran earlier this year on Excel for organizers. Really great stuff. I strongly recommend it if you find yourself frustrated with Microsoft Excel. So the next piece of this, oh, that's not what I wanted to do. The next piece of this that I want to talk about is, oh, okay, there it is researching housing subsidies. These subsidies can come from a lot of different places, basically every level of government, from federal down to state, county, and even some cities may hand out money to real estate developers. And getting a picture of what kind of public money that developers are taking and landlords are taking can be really useful for pressure campaigns. Like if they are, using, people's, tax dollars to, accumulate huge portfolios of property in which they're, basically warehousing people in very poor conditions, that public money can be really, really powerful in a sort of public pressure campaign against them. You may find yourself in a situation where you're, advocating against, further subsidies or something like that. This is just, again, another piece of information that kind of gets at the, like, where does the money come from, that is kind of making money for landlords. One really, really great tool, especially for landlords in the like affordable housing space, is the National Housing Preservation Database. This lets you look up by address, by the name of the development, all kinds of federal subsidies that have gone to landlords, to real estate developers for especially for affordable housing development. I think the probably the biggest federal program is what's called LIHTC. That's the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, which actually it allows real estate developers who build affordable housing to get a tax credit of either 9% or 4% of the cost of constructing that housing for 10 years. And, if they do not have, and so they can use that to lower their own tax bill by that amount. Or more often, what they will do is they'll go through some kind of third party, which will actually bundle that tax credit and sell it to somebody else, some other sort of high income individual or corporation that has a very high tax bill that wants to lower it. And these tax bills are sort of these tax credits are sort of a tradable commodity that developers can actually use to sort of raise like cash in order to finance construction. Um, So to get there, I'm going to navigate to it's nhpd.preservationdatabase.org/data. I think Allie's going to copy that into the chat for us. Already did. Beautiful. And we have basically it's a big searchable spreadsheet. And so I'm going to go into the property name here. And remember, we with our big research dossier we've already compiled about this property in Odin Management, we know that the name of this property is Kings Highway Apartments. So I'm just typing that in, and it's filtered it out into only three entries in the whole database. And by confirming that property address there in the city, we see the other two, one's in St. Louis, one's in somewhere in New Jersey, Gloucester County, New Jersey. We know that this is the one that we're looking for. With some projects, you, you may have to sort of go into some more of the details in order to absolutely confirm that this is the property you're looking for, which is kind of a theme overall in doing this research. Having these data points, knowing like the property address, the name of the LLC, the name of the owner of the property. All of these things are things you can use to compare like new findings to one another to make sure that you're still on the right track, still looking at the same thing. What I'm going to flag here is that the owner name in the database here is Columbus Property Management. And now what I believe the case is here is that this was the owner that originally obtained the tax credit, but then sold the property to Odin later on. Remember that when we were looking at Odin's a business strategy and sort of translating that corporate speak from their website, they talked about sort of buying up taking advantage of the financial crisis to buy up other properties in order to extract value out of them. So if we click details here, this takes us to just a little card that pops up. It gives us some more information like the number of units, how many one bedroom, two bedroom, or three or more, who is the target population, as well as some information about the subsidy itself. So we see here the subsidy name. It's LIHTC. That's the low income housing tax credit. It's the 4% tax credit. And it was first obtained on January 1st, 2001, and this says it runs until 2031. Um, and yeah, I think that's it. But the other thing I guess I wanted to flag here is that somebody earlier had asked about like what if the landlord you're researching is a nonprofit? And forgive me, I haven't like gone through the Q&A to see if that's already been answered. But what I would say is that the research process looks very, very similar for a nonprofit as for a for-profit, with the exception that if it's a nonprofit, there are additional sources of information. And actually, later this year, we're going to be running a training on researching nonprofits. That's another plug for another training you can check out. There's also recordings of previous versions of that on our website. So I'm coming back to our slideshow here. Again, this is what that card looks like, showing what the subsidy is. This will be useful. We're going to be packaging and sending you the slides, and so this kind of just shows what the like actual research result looks like. Lastly, I'm going to talk about like finding a person's like nonprofit and other positions. This is trying to build out a body of information about an individual landlord's personal networks. Do they sit on the boards of any charities or any other sort of social clubs, or do they sit on the boards of any trade groups or other lobbying associations? We can search for their positions on nonprofit boards of directors by using ProPublica's Nonprofit Explorer tool. This is a great tool that sort of compiles information from all of the public tax returns filed by nonprofit organizations and allows us to search not just by the name of the nonprofit, but we can choose to search within these tax filings for the names of specific people. So leaving the slideshow again to run a quick demonstration, I'm at projects.propublica.org/nonprofits. Oh, yeah, thank you for that, Lauren. I totally forgot to say that because I was already logged in. But yes, you do have to create an account to access NHPD. It's free. It takes, probably all of 30 seconds. You just have to put in your stuff and respond to an email. But Nonprofit Explorer. This is the page that you land on, and you could search a few different ways. If you just know the name of the nonprofit you want to research, you just type it in right there with nonprofits. But we're interested in, does Philip Balderston sit on the boards of any corporations organized as nonprofits, I wonder? Well, let's find out by putting his name in the people search field. And as it happens, he is on the boards, or he has sat on some nonprofit boards of directors. We could see right here he's the board treasurer for the Dominion Valley Men's Golf Association. This was as of 2025, which is about as recent as a filing as we're going to get. The filings for any given year don't usually come until the end of that year. So that we have a 2025 one is actually kind of impressive. But in 2024 he was on the board of trustees of the Weitzman National Museum of American Jewish History. 2024 he was president of the Community Education Alliance of West Philadelphia. And as we scroll down, we could see several of these for different organizations. If we're interested in only the most recent of these, we can filter it by year. So I clicked the little year drop down here, and I'm just doing it by 2025 and 2024 just to see what shakes out. And as we see here again, we've got that Dominion Valley Men's Golf Association. So this says to me that this person is interested in golfing and has a governance role at a golf club. This says this is important to him. This is something where he spends a lot of his time. This could be a potential leverage point. Hi everyone, Rob Galbraith here again, speaking you from a few days after this training actually happened, with a quick mea culpa and a correction. So if you were following along with your Power Researcher hat on very closely, you may have noticed that the Dominion Valley Golf Association that I identified as being a board that Philip Balderston of Odin Properties sits on was located in Haymarket, Virginia, and not in Philadelphia, where we know all of Odin's other businesses are. In fact, this turns out that I identified the wrong Philip Balderston as being on that board. So I wanted to drop in just a quick comment here about this mistake, which is, very common, can happen in power research, and really speaks to something I mentioned during the training, which is that you need to be very certain cross-referencing the different sources that you're relying on against other bodies of information that to ensure that you are identifying the correct things about the correct people. In this case, this was a person who shares the same name as Philip Balderston, also spelled the same way, but this person is actually somebody who resides in Virginia and is not the CEO of Odin Properties. So wanted to jump in here again, take this opportunity to say, always check your sources, especially if you're going to be publishing information. You want to be sure that you are identifying the correct things about the correct people. So with apologies to the Philip Balderston of Virginia, I'm going to drop you back where we interrupted this training. But just keep in mind that, yes, that the Philip Balderston I identified in this example was not the same one, although the Philip Balderston on the boards in Philadelphia does appear to be the same person. All right, back to your regularly scheduled training. So, and same goes for several of these other organizations. Again, this is what your results look like in a non-live form. So yeah, coming back to our scavenger hunt, we know uh, we now know that Odin Properties owns this apartment. Philip Balderston's the CEO there. We know his business model. We know the shady stuff that he's been doing, and sort of people have been trying to hold him accountable for. We know that he's been giving money to politicians. We know he's for at least for this property, he's gotten a LIHTC tax credit. We know that he's into golf. We know he's on the board of the Weitzman Museum in Philadelphia. We have a pretty good picture of what this guy is all about. But then what else might we want to look for? This is sort of calls back to a previous slide. It has a lot of the same things, but this is specifically just focused on like what are the personal and political networks of landlords. One kind of huge aspect that we might be interested in is what attorneys are they hiring, and that is sort of kind of speaks directly to like who is kind of like upholding landlords' powers. So we can look at subsidy applications from other economic development agencies or building permits and court records or news searches to find out if they're hiring the same lawyers and law firms over and over and over again. Because those might, again, depending on the context of your campaign, those lawyers may end up sort of being, opposition that you need to overcome in your campaign as well. Political networks, same thing. You're going to be wanting to look for what local politicians they're donating to as well. Do they belong to any trade groups? Molly mentioned the National Apartment Association. I know from our preparation for this that Odin is part of the Pennsylvania Apartment Association, the sort of state level affiliate there. Then personal networks by reading those bios, by finding out where they have other board positions, by finding stories or biographical things that may have been written about them, we can find out who is in their personal networks. And then the financiers, by looking at subsidy applications and awards, we can see how much public money they're getting. By looking at mortgage filings, we can determine, what banks are lending them money. And again, news searches can be really useful for all of these things too. It's definitely getting a lot worse to use various search engines, but it can still be really powerful, and especially if you have a access to university libraries, or if your public library has subscriptions to databases like Factiva or LexisNexis, you can really sort of dig down into news reporting about landlords and real estate developers. Some more local tools that may be useful as well. These are like code violation databases. Again, if you are running like an accountability campaign, most cities will have some sort of, or most larger cities anyways, will have some sort of like open data portal where you can search for code violations by property addresses or owners. Local court records, usually I think you can search, at least in New York where I live, you can search court records to see, have these landlords been sued by tenants or contractors that they may have built, or are they going out and suing other people? Again, this is another sort of depending where you live one, but you may have publicly accessible records of how many people they're evicting from their housing. Is this like part of their strategy to move people in as fast as possible, squeeze a few months of rent out of them, and then evict them as fast as they can to turn it over and kind of run the same trick on a new person? Your state and local economic development agencies may have documentation of subsidies that they've received. And depending on, what they have accessible publicly, you may also find some good information about property ownership, financing, and attorneys in there. Then finally, mortgages are going to be filed with your county clerk. Some counties will have these available online. Other ones you may have to go in person. You stretch those legs, put some shoe leather on the road, go down to the basement and crack open the big dusty books to see. It can be really fun to do that. I'm kind of joking about it, but it's actually, if it's good and tangible. And you can find mortgage documents that'll have information again. Um, you know, information about people behind LLCs because an LLC can't sign a piece of paper or that an actual person has to do it, but also again getting in that information about the banks. All of these things, may or may not be available online. Like I said, mortgage records, you may have to go down to the clerk to get it. Another option for all of these things are filing freedom of information or right to know requests. Those can often take a lot longer to be fulfilled. And so my like recommendation, I guess, when it comes to that is, if this stuff is not available online that you're finding, and before you try to file a freedom of information or right to know request, make a phone call first to a likely source of this information and say, "Hey, I'm interested in looking for this." Uh, in my experience, that more frequently will get you the information you're looking for in a timely fashion. I find that very frequently government agencies will view a right to know request as sort of like an antagonism against them and really kind of drag their heels and take the like statutory maximum amount of time and even acknowledging they've gotten it, much less fulfilling it. So that's a little tip when it comes to FOIA, but that can also be, really useful as well um, if you're yeah kind of not finding what you're looking for on the World Wide Web. Just general research tips now. We're nearing the end, I promise here. Keep organized. Keep lists of business names and addresses. I know Lauren mentioned this at the top, but it bears saying again. You will encounter just a staggering number of names and addresses of people, of LLCs, of corporations and shell companies and addresses where all of these different entities reside or have offices. Use keep lists of these things and what is connected to what. It's going to be incredibly useful to do that. Again, keep your focus. Um, there's a huge amount of stuff that you can look up about landlords. So always be reflecting back on what your campaign goals are, what you're trying to do, what questions you set out to answer at first. Because it can be very easy to get kind of pulled down a rabbit hole. So, focus your research on persuading decision makers, bringing in allies, neutralizing your opposition. Be persistent. Again, search various spellings of names, leave some letters out. Remember with the example we've been using the whole time, it's not King's Landing Apartments. It was King's Landing Apts LLC. Things like that can, just by searching a variation, you can end up, finding something that you were looking for that you weren't able to before. Then, of course, there's no shortcuts here. Research is a part of a campaign. It is not, it's research doesn't generally tend to win campaigns on its own. This is about supporting, organizing and solidarity between and among people. There's not going to be like a silver bullet, fact that you find that turns a campaign from a losing one to a winning one. So, refine your strategy and tactics, identify, potential leverage points, but, this is research is part of it. It's not the whole thing. Yeah, some last kind of other research resources that are out there. There's folks sort of mapping where evictions are happening and who is doing them. Bargaining for the common good has done some great work, kind of looking at these trade associations, the big nonprofit lobby groups that are out there fighting against tenants' rights, fighting for landlords. There's a lot of stuff out there, beyond just these things. So, kind of follow your nose, I guess, when it comes to that. I think it's my turn to kick it back to Molly now.
Cool. Can you go through the next few slides for me, Rob? We'll just keep your
Absolutely.
screen. Awesome. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Lauren. We know that was a lot of information. Hopefully, there are things that will be helpful to you in the research you're doing. Um, like we said before, we will share this slide deck and a recording. We also have other resources through twittlesis. So if you go to mapthepower.net, you can see our kind of overall guides to power mapping corporations and powerful individuals. That's kind of a bit broader than landlords. So we definitely recommend you check that out. We can go to the next slide. And we're going to wrap up here. We have one poll now for the end that I think Allie can launch. And again, we really appreciate you all letting us know how tonight's training was. We're hoping to do this again next year. And so it's really helpful for us to hear from you all what were the most useful parts of tonight. And we'll again give you maybe 2 minutes to do that. Awesome. We'll give people like 30-ish more seconds to answer. Awesome. I think we can close it up. Thank you, everyone. That's will be very helpful for us in the future. And we can go to the next slide, Rob, if you can. So yes, we will email you as long as you were registered tonight for the webinar with slides and recording, but you can also scan this QR code to find a folder with the slides from tonight as well as our other trainings from this year. So I'll give people a second if you want to scan that. Awesome. And we can go to the next slide. We can skip that one because I already talked about that. And then the last thing is we do these trainings for free. We want to continue being able to do that. So if you feel so inclined to throw us a few dollars after tonight's training, we would appreciate it. You can scan there to donate, or you can go to littlesis.org/donate after tonight. Give people a couple seconds. And then lastly, we're here to answer your questions on any research issues that you're having, follow-up questions from tonight's training. Lauren's info and Rob's info is here. So feel free to reach out to them or any of us at Little Sis if you need some support. And I think that is all. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to Rob, Lauren, and Allie for making tonight happen. Bye, everyone.
Oh, bye. Hi everyone, Rob Galbraith here again, speaking to you from a few days after this training actually happened, with a quick mea culpa and a correction. So, if you were following along with your power researcher hat on very closely, you may have noticed that the Dominion Valley Golf Association that I identified as being a board that Philip Alderston of Odin Properties sits on was located in Haymarket, Virginia, and not in Philadelphia, where we know all of Odin's other businesses are. Um, in fact, this turns out that I identified the wrong Philip Balderston as being on that board. So I wanted to drop in just a quick comment here about this mistake, which is, very common, can happen in power research, and really speaks to something I mentioned during the training, which is that you need to be very certain cross-referencing the different sources that you're relying on against other bodies of information that you know to ensure that you are identifying the correct things about the correct people. In this case, this was a person who shares the same name as Philip Balderston, also spelled the same way, but this person is actually somebody who resides in Virginia and is not the CEO of Odin Properties. So wanted to jump in here again, take this opportunity to say, always check your sources, especially if you're going to be publishing information. You want to be sure that you are identifying the correct things about the correct people. So with apologies to the Philip Alderston of Virginia, I'm going to drop you back where we interrupted this training. But just keep in mind that, yes, that the Philip Alderston I identified in this example was not the same one, although the Philip Alderston on the boards in Philadelphia does appear to be the same person. All right, back to your regularly scheduled training.